I want to talk about silence. I only have a few minutes, but we want to talk about it in a couple different ways. First, we'll talk about it from a literal perspective, that is, staying quiet. And then we want to talk about it in terms of silencing the mind and then silencing the soul. Okay? So to begin, silence in the Islamic tradition, there are two words that are usually referred to for silence, and that's samt, which you have in your vocabulary list, I believe, then also sukut. Okay? Samt and sukut are basically synonyms, but that is to remain quiet, to be quiet, to find silence. And then we also have two related words that come in the Quran, which aren't synonyms, but they're related. So we have istima' and we have insat. Istima' and insat are basically synonyms, and it means to give your ear. It means to listen closely, to hearken. So we have a verse from Surah Al-A'raf, that is chapter 7. That's verse 204. وَإِذَا قُرِئَ الْقُرْآنُ فَاسْتَمِعُوا لَهُ وَأَنْصِتُوا لَعَلَّكُمْ تُرْحَمُونَ. When the Quran is being recited, when you hear the Quran being recited, shh, be quiet, listen, give your ear to the recitation. Perhaps then you'll attain something of God's mercy. So it's not a direct relation to sukut or samt, but here God is telling us that there's something important here that's being recited. There's something important in this kalam, this speech of God, that you have to pay attention to, that you have to give your ear to. Okay? So as an opposing angle here, I want to quote something from the Bible, not because it's authentic, but because it's thematically relevant to us here. So in the book of Exodus, chapter 20, verse 19, the Hebrews, Benu Israel, they say to Musa, after they've been taken out of the shackles from Pharaoh, they've been, miraculously saved, Musa splits the Red Sea, etc. And they tell Musa, let not God speak to us lest we die. In other words, we don't want to hear God directly. You're going to be our intermediary. We want to keep God at arm's length. We'll do our rituals, we'll believe in Him, but we don't want to deal with the seriousness, the reality of God's kind of sublime presence. Right? So we want to keep God at arm's length. We want to stay, in other words, to quote the Jews, in this case, the Hebrews of Moses' time, we want to keep God at arm's length, God at arm's length. In other words, we want to remain on the level of the superficial. Okay? Now, it seems like that's probably condemnable, especially considering they were just saved by God like multiple times. They were just given, manna and quail from the skies, and God has been speaking to them directly with His creation over and over and over again, and then they say, okay, that's enough. It's too heavy for us. It's too serious. But then if we think about ourselves, probably notice that most of us fall into this day to day. Sometimes sometimes unjustifiably, critique those who are a little too serious about religion. There is a type of seriousness that's a problem, but some people are just sincere, and we kind of think, oh, it's kind of lame. Or why are they so worried about everything? Why are they thinking all the time? Why aren't they just having fun? A lot of us kind of fall into that. Take it easy, right? The weird thing, though, is that Islam, religion in general, but Islam in particular, at least in the Quran, God says that we've created you and the jinn for a particular purpose. What is the purpose? Worshipping Him, yes. So in other words, we've started at God. We were birthed into this world, and we're on a journey back to God, right? We're making a journey, a hijrah back. Now, our duty is not merely to make it back in one piece, or our duty is not merely to make it back with a couple of bumps and bruises, or, God forbid, spiritual amputations. We're supposed to make it back to God more whole, more holy, more whole. In other words, we're supposed to have taken on more of the attributes of God throughout our life, which requires us to go beyond the superficial It requires us to invite God into our lives and not keep God at arm's length. Okay? So we want to talk about samt, sukut, silence largely as a concept, and 3 different ways to explore this issue. Okay? To move from the superficial and move a little bit deeper, inshallah. So we're going to talk about 1, quieting the tongue, 2, quieting the mind, and 3, quieting the soul. So we'll start with quieting the tongue. There's a tradition that's narrated that says, Man samata sanima. The one who is silent is sanim. He's safe. She's safe. One who holds his tongue is safe. So what does that mean? At the most foundational level, we could say the most superficial level, but we're going to build from here. So at the most foundational level, this is indicating that when we hold our tongues back from the sins of the tongue, gossip, slander. What's the difference between gossip and slander? Somebody tell me. Which one is not true? Slander. Okay, so backbiting, riba, it's actually true about the person. I just want to mention that because some people think backbiting is when I'm lying about somebody. No, riba is when I say something about somebody that is actually true. You can't do that, as long as you know that they would be upset about you doing that. Backbiting, slander, lying. Can't lie. Mockery. Mockery is huge in our society, right? A little too much insensitivity to people's feelings. And being quick to give your opinion. Being quick to give your opinion when you don't know. Or, I think there was a discussion maybe last night about judgment or something. I wasn't here, so I wasn't able to benefit, but being quick to judge without reflecting first. Okay? Being too quick. If you hold your tongue back from that, you'll be safe from those sins, from that dirtiness of sin that you'll acquire. And then there's a worldly benefit as well. When you hold your tongue and you're not quick to answer all the time, you won't be known as kind of foolish. Maybe you know somebody in your life that, maybe it was that one kid in that philosophy 101 class that always thought he knew something but he didn't. And you start to look at him like, that silly kid, what is he? He's lost his dignity, right? Sometimes when we get too excited or we think we know everything or whatever, we talk too much, and we say that, right, in English. Oh, that guy talks too much. So if you hold your tongue more, then in some sense people hold you in higher esteem. Now, what about the silence of the thumbs? We don't want to talk about silence just in terms of wagging the tongue, but also in our age, we're constantly being Trump, right? We're constantly tweeting, we're constantly sending out WhatsApp messages, we're constantly, getting into flame wars on Facebook. Do they still say that, flame wars? Constantly arguing over the internet, or talking over the internet, or whatever. So I think as an appended aspect here to samt, we can talk about holding one's thumbs back, or holding one's fingers back, okay? And maybe even that's more important because that veil of the screen, the kind of the hijab that comes with the internet, makes us even more vicious sometimes. Right? If you look at comments, you go into New York Times, you read an article about something about Muslims, and then you look at the comments, or you look at Breitbart. Read the comments on Breitbart. Those people would never say those things. Very few of them would say those things to your face, right? Because they're behind the screen, they don't see the pain in somebody else's eyes. And so they're quick to go ahead and say whatever craziness that they want to say. And we fall into these things at a much less extreme level. And sometimes maybe we're a little too snarky with our mom when we text back, or we're a little too snarky with our friends or whatever. We want to kind of step back before we send a text or before we say something to somebody else. Think about it and then make a decision to speak. Man samata sanima. The one who is silent is safe. Now moving to the silence of the mind. In the chapter 25, that's Surah Al-Furqan, 72, we have a portion of that verse, Marru bil-lagwi, marru kirama. God here is talking about different attributes of the believers. And he says, and those who, when they come upon lagw, when they come upon Anybody know what that word means? Vain talk. Nonsense. Talk that is null and void, that doesn't have any worth, that should be completely disregarded. They say the believers are like those who walk on by. Not only do they not engage in it, they don't even let it enter their minds. Okay? They walk beyond it. They leave it behind themselves, right? So it's different than holding the tongue, because here you're clearing your mind of empty thoughts. Perhaps some of you seem to have indicated that you felt that when you were sitting outside, that somehow some stuff was just exiting and you were coming back to something more real, perhaps. The problem with that, or the reason for that perhaps, is because we are constantly indulging in stuff that doesn't matter that much. I'm not talking about like crazy stuff or like haram things necessarily, but sometimes we're like news junkies. The word junkie comes from like a heroin addict, for instance, and he's a junkie. We call ourselves news junkies, and some people call themselves that with pride. That means there's a bit of a problem, especially because news is typically little bits of information about what's going on in the world without any kind of underlying principle. You're often not processing that information. And news, Facebook, constant scrolling. I'm not saying don't use Facebook, don't get me wrong. I'm just saying the amount of media, the amount of information, even if it's not media, maybe you're reading books all the time, but if you're never sitting back and processing, silencing the mind from bringing more information in, you're never really building. You're always kind of constantly pulling in, and never kind of synthesizing. So we should begin to think about our media intake, because we have unlimited bandwidth for our mental capacity, for our memorization capacity, and also for our emotional capacity. Especially with the news, you see a lot of people who read a lot of news and they're always like kind of depressed, become hopeless a little bit, because the state of the world is crazy. But they never really step back to process it. So I wake up, I have my coffee, somebody got bombed, I have lunch, I'm taking my lunch break, somebody else got bombed, I go home and read the news again, and somebody else got bombed, and then what am I going to do about it? Okay. You're never taking the time to think about how to address these issues. Now, here what is my time? I'm good? Okay. 10 minutes. Sometimes when we're thinking about the silencing of the mind, we need to think critically about the tools that we use as well. So just a personal anecdote about how the tools that we use and the type of media that we take in can change our character. And that's the bottom line here with silencing the mind. If we don't silence the mind appropriately, our character begins to shift. So for instance, I was one of the last holdouts amongst my group of friends from getting a smartphone. And I kind of had that as a point of pride. Then I finally got a smartphone, I got a data plan, and I noticed probably within 3 to 4 to 5 months that my ability to sit down with a book changed quite drastically. I was on the computer before, but as long as I wasn't on the computer, I could sit down with a book. But now, my phone's right here. Constant picking up, oh, what did somebody say? Oh, I got another text, whatever. Blinking lights. It changes your way of engaging with static text, right? You don't have a blinking ad here. You don't have, oh, there's another, I got another text here, or WhatsApp thing comes down from the top and tells you somebody said something to you. So your concentration changes. Then on top of that, I'm part of a WhatsApp group with about 25 friends from around the country. That's how we stay in touch. When you have 25 guys on a WhatsApp, it's constant banter, nonsense banter, trolling, jokes about random stuff, oh, inside jokes galore, etc., etc. And when you're reading 400, 500, some days 1,000 messages, that's just that. What you're doing is and if you're responding a lot, you're using a lot of your mental energy to think up the next clever response to some other dumb thing somebody else said. Before I had all of this stuff in front of me, I would never have thought I would have ever even indulged in that, just because it wasn't in front of me. Now that I've had it for 2 years, fast forward to a couple of weeks ago, I had about 25 to 30 friends over. We got together, we had dinner, and we watched, there's a film called Minimalism on Netflix. Anybody watched it? Okay, that's a minimal response. We watched minimalism, and we had somebody who brought up some comments to talk about this, and we wanted to have like an hour-long discussion about this. Every comment was a trolling comment about the movie. There was no real engagement with what the message of the movie was. 2 years ago, the same friends, we would have gotten together and we would have had a really deep, useful discussion. We would have debated the merits and demerits of what the movie was trying to tell us. So then we realized that, and then we had another hour-long discussion talking about, okay, what's going on here? Everybody noticed that our culture as a group had changed because of this constant banter back and forth, this constant kind of flat, superficial jokiness on the WhatsApp. So it does change you. So maybe next time you go and sit by a stream, you can kind of think about what things have you imbibed in your life that has perhaps changed you. Now, to wrap up, quieting the soul. There's a tradition that says, Asamtu bi ghairi tafakkur kharas. Silence without tafakkur, silence without reflection, without contemplation, kharas. Meaning it's merely muteness, it's merely dumbness, it's merely holding the tongue. In other words, silence in and of itself is not really a virtue. Just to be silent is not a virtue. Silence is, in the Islamic framework, productive. It ought to be productive. So, we've talked a lot about muhasabah, for instance, this whole retreat. I was hoping somebody would say, I did my muhasabah while I was down by the stream. Maybe some of you did. Muhasabah relies on silence. You have to be quiet with yourself for a little bit to analyze your inner workings, to analyze the day, the last week, whatever, however long you're analyzing. To take account of that requires you to be quiet, to think. But silence without doing that, silence for silence sake, is not worthwhile. As another tradition from the Prophet ﷺ, he's speaking with Abu Dhar, and he's explaining some elements about how to be a good person. And he says basically there are 4 elements that only a mu'min will be able to achieve. And he says one of them, the first one, as-samt. As-samtu huwa al-awwalul ibadah. Worship is the first stage, is the beginning stage of worship itself. So without samt, there is no cleaning of the soul. Without silence, there is no development of the soul. So ibadah then is that last step in purifying the mind and purifying the heart and purifying the soul. It's that but silence is the prerequisite tool for proper ibadah. And then in ibadah is when you silence the soul profoundly. That is when you kind of silence the cacophony of the heart. When you kind of, if you have anxieties, you start dealing with your anxieties. You put them to rest. It silences that kind of spiritual distortion that we all go through day in and day out through odd desires that come up, or focusing on me, those kind of like selfish feelings. It's through ibadah, which relies on silence, that you finally begin to calm your soul down completely. And therein lies kind of the key through returning back to God. Because it is only through silence through which we begin to take on those attributes of God. We become more whole, we become more holy, and we begin to shed off kind of those negative attributes that we've gotten through speaking too much, through thinking about vain things too much. Does that make sense? I hope that makes sense. So I pray, inshallah, that somehow we found in this exercise that we can begin to hopefully schedule maybe a couple times a week to stay light. A couple of times a week where we spend 10 minutes quietly and we begin to explore ourselves, explore our inner workings, explore our anxieties, explore our desires that we don't always know where they're coming from, and begin to work through those things. Inshallah, through that, we'll finally, as Hajj Kawthar keeps talking about, we'll finally begin to awaken, inshallah. Sallallahu ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad.